I am thrilled, over the moon, and speechless and proud and glad to be sometimes wrong and glad to be part of everything that has happened so far. Now, it's only one game, I know. And if Tuesday Colombia doesn't get the win, then it ends up putting them in a situation where, once again, we could be back to zero or close to it. I know all that. I understand all that. I get all that. You can, I can backtrack on it and say, okay. But the boost that this offers Colombia going into World Cup qualifying play is enormous. This boost, I should say, going into Paraguay and knowing that they could put themselves in a very good position. They could even start looking at a top 3 position, depending on how things go in other matches. They could still end up being top 3 going into that break that we're going to have for nearly almost 9 months, or actually about 10 months before we resume World Cup qualifying playing next September. But there was this sense of poetry of everything that happened. It wasn't just football on display tonight, folks. It was just this poetic moment where someone that had suffered so much, because it's very difficult to because for people in Europe, it's very difficult to kind of understand what's going on. I think John Michelobi, when he talked about him having his father kidnapped, kind of put it more in perspective for people in South America than it did for Europeans. For Europeans, it ended up almost being something. Of course, there was a sense of unfortunate circumstance mixed with tragedy, mixed with people kind of focusing on what the overall feeling was. It was more the reaction from Roman Abramovich than anything else. That people understand that people, many in Africa, many in South America, once they make it big and they're from adverse situations socioeconomically, they become targets. And it's very unfortunate to say that all of a sudden they say, oh, he's the one with money. Well, let's see what we can do. He's the one with influence. So let's see what happens. It became the unraveling of several things from a social political perspective in Colombia this match today. The release of joy after having weeks of agony and uncertainty, and of course the relief of Luis Diaz's father being released after he was kidnapped by the ELN in Colombia. It ends up being this pseudo Hollywood type of encounter of movie that ends up being written, where the hero ends up seeing his father being liberated, and he goes and he brings his team back. Of course, he did it with Liverpool, and then a few days later, he comes to the national team and really honors his country. And his father's there to witness it. And the way he was celebrating, it looked, as if he was dying of joy. So all of that. Now, enough with the poetry, because that too had a lot to do with it. The circumstances that the player had to go through, that the family had to endure, et cetera, and many in the country. Of course, there were protests going on around the stadium, basically wanting the president of Colombia out after what he did. Now, me getting into the specifics of that really ends up being inappropriate for this type of video, because that's not what this is about, but I still needed to bring that into context so people understand everything that was going on around the stadium. It looked, early on, it looked pretty dire for Colombia, because Brazil able to get through and find the opening goal of the match, sort of kind of controlling things, because they weren't just controlling the tempo of the match, because after that Colombia reacted relatively well. They were able to find ways to kind of parry the shots, whenever there was danger, they were able to avert it one way or another. They were able to sweep it away, or Colombia was missing and they lacked precision. But as things began to develop with James Rodriguez finding more space, with John Arias getting into the mix a bit more, with more of these players ending up in better situations, you end up seeing a better Colombia. You end up seeing a team that has that talent, and they showed they have that talent. And not only they have the talent, because talent is kind of synonymous with potential because it's not tapped into, but they do end up showing that potential can be reality. And again, it's one of these turning points. Maybe again, I always have to look into the future and kind of use a tennis analogy. It's not a break until you hold kind of thing. So Colombia basically broke. They were able to get a big 3 points at home, but it might not have as much value if they're not able to get a result in Paraguay. So I understand that. But when you see everything that Colombia's been able to do, everything that they worked for so hard, they were the team that worked harder. They were the team that were able to do a great deal. And in a span of, what was it, 4-5 minutes? I think it was in the 80th, 75th, and 80th minute that Luis Diaz. That's where Luis Diaz ends up making the difference. That's why Liverpool went after him. I mean, I don't think I need to tell people about that, but it ends up being Luis Diaz that makes a huge difference. But it's also James Rodriguez stepping in and being able to find pockets of space and finding those intricate moments where Diaz is able to outbeat defenders. And Brazil are having a lot of trouble defending, especially their fullbacks. Regardless of who they are, they've had problems now with Uruguay. They had problems with Venezuela. Now they had problems with Colombia. So even when Colombia were losing, you saw a big mismatch down the right hand, Brazil's right, Colombia's left, with Diaz and I believe it was Emerson Royal who really had a big assignment, and not only that, had a lot of trouble containing Diaz. And it wasn't, just a run where he's just absolutely jaunting down the left-hand side and really causing terror. No, there are crosses that he was able to beat a defender. And he's able to position himself just better or good enough to be able to strike those balls. And Brazil find themselves in a very dire situation right now. They could go home and lose to Argentina, who have blood in their eye after losing to Uruguay. So keep that in mind on Tuesday at Maracanã. It can get very hostile very quick over in a Brazilian stadium, especially if their team is not doing well. But Luis Diaz was great, and James Rodriguez played very well. There were certain players. Now when Nestor Lorenzo started getting more into the substitutions and bringing out Mateus Uribe, who I think should not even play for the national team anymore, and bringing in more dynamic players, bringing in players that can make a difference and push forward in a more proactive manner, you see that Colombia ends up being a better team in the offensive end of the pitch. So to me, that ends up being the major difference for this Colombia side, who, like I said, potential is just static. There's nothing there until it starts moving, until it starts doing, until it starts creating, and until it starts really fulfilling itself. Well, you couldn't say too much. Now with Colombia, the thing is, can they make it 2 in a row? Can they make it 3 in a row? Can they build upon that? That's going to be the interesting thing to look at going into September of next year. And not even that, looking how they prepare for Paraguay, number one, looking how they prepare for March when they have those friendlies. Obviously, they have a match against Venezuela in December, but that'll be mostly the local players. And then, of course, focusing on Copa America next summer. It'll be an interesting year. It now has to depend on Colombia and Colombia alone what steps they're going to take if they're going to return to a World Cup, which, in my opinion, they should.